Webinar in our Coastal Resilience webinar series. Today, we're diving into the vital topic of monitoring and assessment methods in marsh and coastal environments. This webinar will be led by Jesse Buckner, Senior Ecologist and Assistant Program Manager for Sovereign's Natural Resources Program. Jesse brings over 10 years of experience in ecology restoration, conservation, mitigation, and natural resource management. She holds a MS in Applied Geosciences from the University of Pennsylvania. Her expertise spans nature-based coastal resilience, including marsh restoration, living shorelines, and monitoring techniques. This webinar will explore techniques that inform restoration design, strategic planning, and adaptive management, ensuring a strong scientific foundation for coastal resilience projects. Please remain muted during the webinar. We'll have time for some questions at the end. In the meantime, you can submit any questions in the Q&A function. Thank you from all of us at Sovereign for attending.
Thanks, Sydney. We will get it started here. So as Sydney said, today we're going to be talking about monitoring methods in marsh and coastal settings. This is the second in our series talking about coastal resilience. Doug gave a great presentation a couple months ago. We'll have another one in the books that we will let you know about. So first, I'll just give a brief introduction about myself and about Sovereign. Then we're going to talk about assessment and monitoring kind of in a general sense, looking at rapid and long-term assessment, and then focusing on two applied techniques. There are so many techniques, can't cover them all in one webinar. And then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So as Sydney mentioned, I am a senior ecologist. I'm the assistant program manager here at Sovereign. And she mentioned I got my MS at the University of Pennsylvania. And when I was there, I actually did my thesis on wetland monitoring and assessment. So I was working for a partnership for the Delaware Estuary at the time as a science fellow, and I was looking at the rapid assessment method and the site-specific intensive monitoring that were part of the Mid-Atlantic Coastal Wetland Assessment. And you'll see that I reference MACWA a few times throughout this presentation. It's a really important tool for the region, and it's also something that just sort of set up my understanding of the need for monitoring and ways in which to utilize monitoring. And I've been really lucky that I was able to take what I learned during that experience, continue with that work, and then grow upon it. I worked with the New Jersey Nature Conservancy. At the time, we were working on the beneficial reuse of dredge materials projects in South Jersey. So that was a whole different type of assessment, starting to look at monitoring for applied purposes, not just looking at condition assessments, but how does the monitoring reflect the implementation? How successful is a project? I went back to the National Estuary Programs when I went to Barnegat Bay Partnership. I spent some time working in wetlands and mitigation and other biomes for a while. And then I landed here about a year and a half ago with Sovereign, where I still do other things, but I've really brought my focus back into coastal areas, tidal areas, looking at restoration, assessment, monitoring, how these things all play in together. So Sovereign, you guys might know Doug. He's been at Sovereign for a long time. He presents a lot. He's definitely a wealth of institutional knowledge. So a lot of these awards, well, all of these awards are through him, but we have a really robust coastal resilience program. The company itself is MBE certified in New Jersey. We have 140 employees. Although our natural resource section is a small section of that, we are growing. And we do work with a lot of different clients from government, nonprofit, utilities, industrial, some HOAs. You can see some project examples there, some clients that we've worked with. And like I said, our services are great. We have a lot of services, and I don't need to go through all of them. We're just talking about the coastal services today, but like I said, we have urban services, green space, specialized remediation. There's a lot more that Sovereign does than just the things that we're talking about. Somebody said that you're not seeing a presentation. Is everyone not seeing a presentation?
I see the presentation, Jesse, but might want to confirm with someone outside. Maybe just give a thumbs up.
It looks like other people can see it, yeah. Thank
Okay.
you.
Sorry, Caitlin, but thanks for letting me know just in case. And I did put the link for our website there at the bottom. So let's get into assessment and monitoring. I'm primarily going to be talking about field techniques today. So let's start with the project life cycle. When we're talking about applied ecology, it usually is a function. We're not just looking for research to answer questions. We are also looking to implement a project. In our purposes, we're looking for restoration, we're looking for enhancement of ecosystem services, we're looking for climate change resilience, sea level rise resilience. And in these types of projects, we always have to start with the assessment. It's what's going to set up the whole project. Before you get to a design, you're going to need to have the data to understand exactly what the issue is and design the appropriate solution. There are a lot of designs out there that can be fit around a site, but it's not cookie cutter. Every site is going to be site specific. It also plays into the permitting. The permitting is going to require site specific understanding to meet those regulatory requirements. And then the implementation itself is going to require a level of assessment. You know, what kind of sediments are there so that your machinery can sit on top of it? You know, what kind of animals are there? Are you going to need to have time of year restrictions or something like that? And then it's also going to collect the baseline data to continue monitoring. It's going to set you up for having a good analysis, usually looking for that before, after, control, impact, reference if you have it. And I think a lot of times when people are looking to implement projects, sometimes they can come at it from more of a construction perspective, where they're just looking for the necessary engineering pieces. You know, what can we do to engineer this? But there is data that can always be collected that goes back into a larger body of knowledge that makes this an iterative process so every project is better. And I know I'm saying things that a lot of you already know, but just kind of reiterating the importance of these things. So you get through this process where you have your design that's based in the scientific understanding of what is actually a feasible design, what's a sustainable design, and what is going to meet your project goals. I don't need to go into it, but there are ways that you're going to be setting, set your SMART goals, set your goals, and that's going to determine what assessment needs to happen, and then how you're going to design it, permit it, implement it. And then we get to the other side where it's been implemented, and we need to continue monitoring. That monitoring is going to allow for adaptive management to ensure that a project is meeting those goals, and it provides the after in that backy analysis. And it provides an opportunity for lessons learned. And so when you put them together, this kind of before assessment and this after monitoring, you're quantifiably measuring project impacts and outcomes, both in the short term and the long term. We've seen some projects that might seem like they're not doing anything for a few years, like those beneficial reuse projects, and then all of a sudden you can start to see a positive outcome. In other circumstances, you might see a short-term boon where things grow really well for a couple of years with a new hydrologic regime, and then all of a sudden it falls off and your project was only successful for a few years. And at that point, you're able to do that adaptive management that we're talking about. It also provides a basis for the lessons learned, whether that's positive or negative, so you can take that into the next project. And then it can create data sets that can be used by others to answer research questions. So even if your intention isn't the research itself, you are providing data. And if you frame the questions correctly, if you do the monitoring appropriately, it can facilitate research. And it can also facilitate restoration elsewhere. If somebody has a similar issue or a similar marsh to you, you can become that reference. And that data also can help you create system-based tools. So you're not just using models with theoretical data, but then all of a sudden you have the data to create your own tools. And it's based in your experience and what you see as success. And it's a balance because, like I said, not every restoration is a research project. I came from a place that was definitely more research oriented. It is my instinct to collect as much data as possible. And I always want to go 100% into the weeds. When I started working in the private sector, especially, I don't always have that luxury. You know, clients need their shoreline repaired. Clients need things to be done within a certain time frame. Some people don't really care about the data, and we need to collect the data that we need to support the project goals, but not all data needs to be collected every time. So I kind of put these two opposing quotes together. Aldo Leopold, he said, you know, to keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering, which is true. We need to understand a site, but then Michael Soule, the founder of conservation biology, wrote, conservation is a crisis discipline. It is not a field in which one can wait for complete knowledge. And that also holds true. So we get to some of these metrics, and this is by no means a comprehensive list of metrics, but we're generally going to be looking at physical, chemical, and biological metrics. And you can see some of those are, you know, elevation, accretion, erosion, water quality, vegetation, things like that that people are pretty familiar with already. Over here, you can see this picture of Mattia Jepsen from DEP working on a set right here with these fresh marker horizons that we installed. So kind of the first line that I didn't talk about is most people are going to start with some type of remote sensing, but today we're talking more about field techniques. So after you've already established, you know, where your site is going to be, you've already looked at the remote sensing data, you've looked at maps, you've looked at wetlands, soil maps, endangered species maps, historic maps, whatever remote data is available for your area. First, you start with those. Then you're likely to choose some type of general rapid assessment protocol. And there are a lot out there. Again, I referenced MACWA. There's the tidal wetland rapid assessment method, and you can see the way that that's looked at over here in this table on the right. So it looks at these buffers, and this again is kind of part of that desktop analysis. There's an ArcGIS analysis, and then there's a visual assessment in the field. It's looking at the hydrology. Again, it's more of a visual assessment in the field and cross-checked with aerial imagery. It's looking at the presence of ditches, but this again is more qualitative. You're not measuring the width of the ditches or the depth of the ditches. And then habitat. There's a few main pieces to looking at habitat. You're looking at the vegetation, the species richness, percent invasive, and then also adding a metric for bearing capacity where you're looking at the substrate strength. So there are a lot, this is just one example. I also put marsh futures in here, which is more specific to planning for projects. And there's a lot of great aspects of marsh futures, but then some projects don't even have the time and scope to get all of these done. So you might want to pick, you might need to pick one or two of these, you know, whatever your goal is, whatever you're looking at, that's what you need to look at. So these are great for telling you the condition, but they're not going to necessarily indicate the processes. You can see that there's struggling vegetation, but you're not going to necessarily understand why it's struggling. Is it struggling because of subsidence? Is it struggling because of poor drainage? Is it struggling because of an overflow of contaminants? There's a lot of reasons that you're not getting the answers when you're doing these types of rapid assessments. So then you're looking at these long-term and intensive monitoring methods. Unfortunately, when you're talking about most restoration projects, you are not able to do long-term monitoring before you install a project. You can start a long-term monitoring for your project, but you're not going to have that data before you start your project. So when possible, use long-term reference data. If there's long-term reference stations near you, there are a lot set up. There's through MACWA, through the NERS system, the National Estuary Research Reserves. There's a lot of data out there. So explore that data and see how it can tie into your area. And then also look at those methodologies of what would be possible to implement within your project. It might not be possible to get that data beforehand, but what data can you start collecting that can give you a better observation of trends and the success of your project? Another technique you can use is using rapid assessment methods that are already known to be proxies to some of these more intensive metrics. So the one that I included here is bearing capacity is known to directly correlate to below ground biomass. So spending 5 minutes with a slide hammer is going to be a lot less expensive and less labor intensive than going out there, collecting all the biomass, sorting it, burning it, weighing it, doing everything you have to do. So again, I share some of these site-specific intensive monitoring methods from the Mid-Atlantic Coastal Wetland Assessment. For chemical, you're looking at creek water for water quality, sediment quality, YSI water quality. Then looking at your physical with elevation and accretion, and biological with plants, biomass, and animals. And there are so many methodologies that can be used, and a few of the resources for this region that are really helpful. Partnership for the Delaware Estuary has a lot of these monitoring methods in their standard methods bank, and they're organized by category, metric, methods, and the professional level needed. So I think the font is really tiny, but you can kind of see over here how it's set up, where it tells you, if it's in structure, what the metric is, and then it will give you options for the methodology. And then it also tells you what level of experience you need to have to be able to perform this type of methodology. It's really helpful. I use it all the time. There's a lot of standard operating procedures in there, and if not, there are links to other analyses. So you can see up here, this is what it looks like when you click on one of those methods. It has a description of it and then a link to the methodology itself. Other very helpful method banks in New Jersey, there's the Framework for Developing Monitoring Plans for Coastal Wetland and Living Shoreline Projects in New Jersey. It's going to help you select the relevant metrics, the appropriate methods for that, and then create your monitoring plan. And Delaware has a similar thing in its developing monitoring plans for living shoreline projects. In Delaware, a goal-based framework. So I would recommend checking out both of those frameworks, because that's going to give you more of a step-by-step of being able to look at your project goals, determine the metrics, determine the methods, and then create that plan. And then once you've determined which methods, you can look at that PDE standard methods bank and get a lot of those methods. So today, I'm going to talk about two specific metrics that I have been using the most over the last couple of years, and that's going to be elevation and tidal frequency, duration, and depth. So the first applied technique, the specific technique, and one that a lot of us have used, is the water level loggers. They're simple, they're efficient, and they can give you a lot of information. They give you the water pressure, the water depth, and the water level relative to the datum. They can be used for short-term or long-term. And when you're looking at restoration design, they are a good, relatively rapid assessment tool. And I say relatively rapid because you need to leave them in for at least 1 month. But usually that's feasible within the design schedule of a project. And you're going to get a lot of information out of them that will be very relevant to design within a wetland. They're going to tell you tidal dynamics, again, that frequency, duration, depth of inundation across the marsh platform. This is really important to know because these are shifting with sea level rise, they are shifting with changing weather patterns, they are shifting as the marsh geomorphology itself changes. And so we need to see what those tidal dynamics look like in order to work with those tidal dynamics. They're going to tell you the hydro period analysis, which is critical for the vegetation zonation and in turn the restoration design. If you're in an area that is low marsh, you are not going to be planting high marsh species or vice versa. And the elevation, the RTK surveys might tell you one type of elevation and you're thinking it's a high marsh, but based on the hydro period, you might actually be in a low marsh. So you need to either look at raising that platform or planting appropriately. It's going to capture event-based water level spikes, and this can also help determine what the issue on your marsh might be. If you compare the water level data to the winds, you might recognize that when you have westerly winds, it is pushing a larger amount of water onto your marsh than anywhere else. So then you're going to be wanting to look at ways to protect that eastern edge and figure out ways to kind of control what's happening during those times. And it's also going to determine site-specific tide cycles. Not every site is going to be located near a tide gauge. We ran into this on one of our sites recently, actually, where this photo is from. It was in between 2 tide gauges. One was influenced by the bay, one was influenced by the ocean, and we did not have a good idea of what the tide cycles were doing within our specific site. So we put out water level loggers and we were able to determine what this very localized tide cycle looks like and how closely it aligns with the local tide gauges. So that helps us with our planning and again with our further understanding of the marsh. So another thing you could do with it is if you have a series of water level loggers within the site along a creek or further into the uplands, you can determine in a site where water is being held, and you can determine pinch points and whether channel or platform dynamics need to be restored. And then after the fact, when you put them in, you can determine the effectiveness of that restoration. If you set that water level logger out there before restoration and it's holding, let's look at this Station 3 2013 in this experimental graph down here. Before the restoration, that is how much of the time it was inundated, about 80%. After the restoration, it was only holding water 5–10% of the time. So that was a significant change. And because they were looking to restore that area and have it be inundated less because it initially had been a high marsh, that indicates that there was success in that area. And this is from Kenny Raposa paper. Another use is to determine the elevation necessary for platform restoration and for sea level rise resilience. Again, the water level might be different than what your elevation is telling you. So looking at that water level before you create your design is going to tell you what types of interventions need to happen. Again, is that going to be a platform enhancement where you're raising the elevation of the platform itself? Is it a channel adjustment where you are narrowing a channel or adding a channel, adding some kind of drainage, that's going to tell you where you can do that and where you need to do that, and also what that might look like. And then this is a graph of a very long-term data set of water level loggers that were capturing the sea level rise. This is from 1999 to 2019, and you can see where the water is coming in and that level, and that's both, oh, my captions got cut off. But that's the low tide, the high tide, and then the mean sea level there. So you can see each of them where it's being affected. So when you're using these water level loggers, the design, you need to have at least 2 loggers. And that's because you need one for the ambient pressure to act as the kind of the stabilizer, and then one for the water itself. So you can see here, this is kind of the most basic if you don't have a lot of resources. If you just want to look at your area of interest, you can have that ambient logger that is out of the water 100% of the time, you know, up in a tree, on a post, something like that. And then you can put one in your area of interest to see what's going on in that very specific location. You can use 3 of them. You can have one for the ambient, one in a reference area, and then one in your area of interest. So what does it look like in the area that you want your marsh to look like versus what does it look like in the area that you are trying to restore? And then if you have access to more, you can start to look at what does it look like in the channel, in the low marsh, in the high marsh. And you want to base your design to answer your question. You know, is your question how much water is being held in one area of the other? Is it what's the tidal cycle? Different configurations are going to give you different data and different answers. So that's up to you based on your question of what kind of configuration you're going to use. Like I said, you want to leave it out for a minimum of 1 month so that you're capturing some of that variation. And the longer you leave it out, you're able to capture seasonal variations, stochastic variations. You're able to smooth the data set a little bit more. But again, this is considered more of a rapid method. And because of our funding, because of the way these projects work, we don't always have months or years even to leave these things out. So if you can get it out for a month before you start your project, that can significantly help you in your understanding of the site and your design. After your design is implemented, that's a different story. Then, you know, depending on what your monitoring plan is, you might have a year, 5 years, if you're lucky, to see how your implementation has affected the marsh. And it's good to have this before and after data so you can see what that actual difference is. So what are some of the cost of these things? The water level loggers that I'm using are the Hobo, the U20Ls. They're pretty basic. Because they're going in marshes, I don't need them to be rated for very deep. And each logger costs $423.50. So that's one logger. To read the logger, you need to have a base station of some kind. There are different base stations you have if you're using other Hobo products, like if you have a Hobo weather station or a Hobo wave sensor or something like that. They pretty much all can plug into this universal base station. So when you're buying the base station, if you have intention of using other products, it is good to look at what's going to be compatible. And that's about $200. And then the software itself, you used to be able to do everything just through the HoboWare Basic. Now, a lot of these sensors require you to have the Pro HoboWare is what they call it, which is only $75, which compared to a lot of other programs is really not too bad. So you're looking at the bare minimum, you're looking at about $1,500 for that 2 Hobo and able to read it situation. If you want more, you can get more. They last a pretty long time. If the battery starts to die on it, you send it back in, they send it back to you. But again, that takes a few years. Generally, they can stay in the field for about, depending on how you set it, I set mine to take readings every 15 minutes. They can last about 4 months in the field without needing to be collected. There are definitely more expensive models that you can get that will send the data to you directly without having to come back and collect it. But they're significantly more expensive, but they can be very helpful if you're setting up an actual long-term monitoring station. There's an indirect cost. You need to bring out an RTK to measure that elevation. You want to have a pretty specific elevation because when you're looking at the water levels, you want to see how they're sitting at the NAVD88 and also within that tidal datum. And when you go to analyze your data, you're going to input that elevation of the hobo itself, and you're also going to input the depth of the water at installation. So there's a few things that you need to measure. And then also just the housing and the mounting wear. It can be pretty simple. You can see in here that we just got a piece of PVC, drilled a bunch of holes in it, used some zip ties and pounded the rebar in as far as we could. And then I just have the, pink marker so I can see it if it gets super muddy. And then paying for the labor itself. The preparation doesn't take a long time. Like I said, it's about 15 minutes per logger, which includes cutting the PVC, drilling the holes, and then also launching it before you go in the field. The installation, I said 45 minutes, and that's the securing and the measuring. That's not including your time between sites. That doesn't include the walking. So it doesn't take a long time to install as long as your sites are fairly accessible. And then the collection, if you're not redeploying them, it only takes about 10 minutes. You can grab it, you can put it into the reader, get the data, you're done. But if you're redeploying them, then you kind of have to go through that installation process. Not to the same amount because your rebar is already there, but you have to put the PVC back up. And then analysis time really depends on the analysis. So the water level loggers on their own can be really helpful, but as with most data, if you give it a second point, it can be even more robust. So if you pair it with other data, it will give you more robust understanding of marsh dynamics. So you can see this graph here, that's from a USGS project where they have these study marshes, and within them, they're taking sediment cores, they're looking at water quality, they have surface elevation tables, and they're taking water level readings. So this is giving them a pretty robust data set to be able to look at all of these different data points and how they're interacting. And that's when you start to be able to understand the marsh processes. So the other technique that we're going to look at is, again, something that people have talked about a lot, but surface elevation tables. And those surface elevation tables are measuring the relative elevation change of wetland sediments. And they're paired with marker horizons, those feldspar white chunks that you see, and geodetic benchmarks. So using the RTK or other relative elevation measurements to explain the processes of accretion or subsidence, and they are a very important tool in measuring a marsh's ability to keep pace with sea level rise. And this is the diagram by Cahoon that I think everybody is probably pretty familiar with. The way that these work is they have rods that are pounded deep into the marsh, basically to the point of resistance, and they can go down pretty far, 90 feet or so. They actually come in 5-foot sections. So you pound one in, you screw it together, pound another one in, screw it together. And then at the top, there is this receiver. And when people are ready to read the set, they come back with this set arm that's shown here. And then it has these fiberglass pins that are dropped onto the surface of the marsh. And then the elevation itself is measured to the millimeter scale. And everything is calibrated very heavily. Readers have to read with each other to calibrate against each other. The pins themselves are measured before every use. There's a lot that goes into it. And the reason that they're paired with these marker horizons is so that you can see what is accretion versus subsidence. So you can actually see in this marsh brownie here of how much sediment has accumulated on top of that original feldspar layer. And they are definitely a long-term investment. Like I said, you are pounding these things 90 feet, sometimes more, into the ground. They are not going anywhere once they're in. So they do require upfront time and money to install them and training people to read them. And they can show you a trend within 3 to 5 years, but most programs are looking for 5 or more years of data. And it's when it's over 10 years that that data becomes the most powerful. And I just included some data sets over here where you can see these elevations over a 20-year time scale. Because this is a long-term investment, I understand that their projects are not often able to implement something like this. But there are a lot of reference networks that people can plug into. So if there aren't any projects on your site or near your site, see if you are able to capture changes, especially if it's a project that is dealing with elevation or dealing with sediments. I chose some photos here. This is the Avalon Marsh in South Jersey, and this is us installing them. So like I said, we have to get onto the marsh with a demo hammer, pound them in. This was us trying to finagle the generator onto the marsh to run that demo hammer. So it is a whole process, but it's worth it once you get it in there, especially, like I said, when you're looking at what is the long-term change of something like a beneficial reuse project. You know, it's something we're still learning a lot about, and it is very site specific of what these effects are going to be short-term and long-term. So how do we measure that? But realistically, if installation and monitoring is beyond budget and scope, you can identify local set networks that you can use as reference data. The New Jersey Tidal Wetland Monitoring Network recently launched its website or updated its website, but it looks great. Here's an image of that over here, so you can see all of these different existing sets on the elevation change layers. And you can click on all of these and get more data. Chesapeake Bay, their Sentinel Site Cooperative, has really similar data. So you can see, is your project in one of these clusters? If so, you're really lucky, you can tie into that. Is it in one of these blank areas? Then you might need to put in your own set. And because there are networks that exist like this, if you are interested in installing a set, you can reach out to the New Jersey Tidal Wetland Monitoring Network and see if they're able to help you with installation, help you with the knowledge, help you with the monitoring, and also potentially help you find funding for it. Because it is such an important metric, and the better our networks are, the better it is for everybody because it provides a full reference set. So why are they useful for projects and not just for research? First, they're going to provide the pre-project elevation benchmarks that are, again, tied into that NAVD88. They're going to document initial platform conditions before construction or planting takes place. And then they're going to track your project performance for that elevation loss or gain. They can inform adaptive management, so measuring that ability to keep pace with sea level rise. And then also, if it's not, setting those trigger thresholds for additional intervention, whatever that looks like. And then it scales lessons. It scales the lessons learned because it feeds that data back into those regional networks and allows that site to be compared to reference marshes. So it benefits your site because now you have data to compare them to other marshes, but also eventually you become part of those reference marshes as well. And then improves future restoration design by showing which approaches are building the long-term elevation resistance. So going to some of these direct costs, like I said, it can be a little bit pricier. The set arm itself is the most expensive direct piece of this. It's $3,000 to $5,000 depending on which type of reading you're doing, whether it's a deep rod or a shallow benchmark. The benchmark rods itself can cost $1,000 for the installation. Again, you'd probably buy them by the bundle. The marker horizon materials, again, not too expensive, $200 for the feldspar, and then the protective housing. And then the indirect costs, again, are going back to that surveying and benchmarking. So you're going to go out with an RTK or whatever the approved method is. New Jersey Tidal Wetland Monitoring Network is working with National Park Service and NGS and a couple other folks, myself included, to actually explore what these surveying methods should be moving forward that are the most precise, but also the most cost effective. You're going to be, again, it's pretty labor intensive, requires some specialized training for the installation and the reading. Boat and site access can cost, and then the monitoring costs themselves. So what about when you put these data together, when you have the water level loggers and the surface elevation table? So the water level loggers are catching your hydrology, and they are setting the stress and opportunity context, whereas the set is measuring the geomorphic response. And so it's showing the system's response to the stress or the opportunity. And this came out very blurry, but it's just, again, showing the pairing of having these sets and water level loggers, and that it's a pretty common pairing to have both of these within a restoration site. So again, some of the practical applications when you're putting this data together is looking at the hydro period and the elevation trends. If the water level loggers are showing prolonged flooding, but the sets aren't showing any elevation gain, then that marsh is at drowning risk. If the water level loggers show frequent inundation and the sets are showing elevation gains, then healthy sediment and nutrient capture is happening. It's also going to give you design validation. The logger data can confirm the zone, the low versus high marsh that plants are experiencing, and the set data can confirm if those zones are stable enough to sustain plant communities. Is that plant community going to be shifting within the next few years? And then it provides a context for sea level rise. The loggers providing the rising baseline, the relative sea level, and then sets providing the marsh trajectory of how it's keeping pace. So again, reiterating why monitoring and assessment matter from a practitioner's lens. I think it can be hard to meet in the middle sometimes as a practitioner, as a consultant, depending on who you're working for, who you're working with, who the client is, to meet that balance. But everything has to be based in reality, whether that reality is the scientific principle, but also the budget and the timeline. So when you're doing the monitoring assessment, it's going to ensure that design assumptions hold. It's going to assume that the elevations you're planting in are actually going to be functional. You're going to be able to establish there. It's going to ensure hydrologic reconnection, and it's going to ensure that those sediment budgets are actually grounded in real site data and not just models, not that site that's 50 miles away, in actual data. It gives you an early warning of underperformance, if a marsh is degraded, if a marsh is drowning. So you can course correct before there's a full failure, before a marsh is completely unvegetated, before it's turned into open water, before the development that is behind that marsh is at risk of flooding and the other dangers when that marsh goes away. It strengthens your permit compliance and reporting. Having objective data is going to satisfy those regulatory requirements and demonstrate accountability. It shows that you know what you're doing. It shows that you care why you are doing something. And building on that, it builds trust with stakeholders and funders. Data-driven results are much easier to communicate and defend than just observational or qualitative observations. You know, it's all well and good to say, yeah, I know my project's going to work. Everybody does a living shoreline. But why is your living shoreline going to work in that specific area? It facilitates scaling and replication when monitoring and assessment are done using the scientific method. Those lessons can be replicated from one site to another, from one site to a region. They can inform future projects within the region or within that same habitat type. And then finally, it supports adaptive management. Again, it's trigger-based decisions, nourishment, replanting, hydrologic. They all rest on that monitoring feedback. You can't just put it in and hope for the best. So what are my takeaways? The assessment and monitoring are the backbone of restoration. You know, I think we all want to get to the implementation. We all want to see the final result. You know, we want to get it done. We want to see as much restored as possible. But to do that correctly, we have to take the time to do the initial assessment and set up the monitoring before any of the implementation even happens. You know, we want to have a strong scientific experimental design so that we are able to actually analyze the data that we're collecting. There's no point in collecting a bunch of data if we don't have a way to analyze it later on. So that backbone is going to inform the design, the permitting, the implementation, and the adaptive management. And then with the rapid versus intensive methods, you have to choose the right balance of cost, scope, and rigor to match project goals. It's going to be specific. The water level loggers, they're going to give critical hydrologic context. Like I said, the tidal dynamics, hydro period, storm surge, sea level rise. The surface elevation tables, they're going to track that long-term marsh platform change, accretion, subsidence, resilience to sea level rise. And together, they're going to provide a fuller picture. They're going to give you the stressor versus response, short-term versus long-term trends. And data should serve multiple scales. It should give project evaluation, adaptive management, into regional networks, and then lessons for future designs. So that is a lot. There are so many things to say about monitoring and assessment. There's so many methods that I could have gone down the rabbit hole with, but I just chose two for the sake of time for the purpose of this webinar today. But I'm happy to take any questions or comments. I see in the chat, Dave said after monitoring, I would close the cycle with assessment or evaluation. And I think that's very true. You know, you have this ongoing monitoring, but at the same time, at some point, you do need to have kind of a final evaluation. Any other questions or comments? Well, if no one has anything else, I will give you your time back. My information is on the screen, my email, my phone number. And if you ever have any monitoring or assessment needs or questions, I love talking about it. I love doing it. So please let me know.
Thank you everyone for joining, and we hope that you have a great rest of your week.